They laughed. My own daughter looked me in the eye, smirked, and said, "Dad, you look cheap." I didn't say a word. I didn't raise my voice. I just clapped for her like every other proud father in the room. But inside, something broke. And I knew then, the day she mocked the very suit that carried our family through decades, would be the day she finally learned what it really cost. My name's Walter Hayes, and I'm 72 years old. I've lived in the same brick house on the corner of Maple and Vine for almost 40 years. The shutters are faded, the lawn's a little patchy, and the mailbox leans just slightly after a delivery truck nudged it last winter. But it's mine. Paid off, fair and square, with sweat from my brow and more overtime hours than I care to count. If you're listening to me now, I'd like to know, where are you from? A big city, a small town like mine? Because maybe, just maybe, you'll understand what it means when I say that in places like this, money doesn't come easy, but love is the only currency that never runs out. I wasn't always an old man with aching knees and silver hair. I was once a young husband, a father-to-be, working the late shift at the factory. My wife, Margaret, would sit up waiting for me with a pot of stew warming on the stove. She'd greet me with that tired smile of hers, one hand on her belly, telling me, "It's worth it, Walt. Every long hour, every cut on your hands, it's worth it." And she was right. Because when our daughter Emily came into the world, I swore I'd give her everything I could. Not riches, not luxury, but security, a roof that didn't leak, a plate that was never empty, and a father who showed up, always. I never was much for appearances. My wardrobe, if you can even call it that, was simple. A rotation of work shirts, 2 pairs of good boots, and 1 suit. Just one. Navy blue, bought back in 1978 for our wedding. Tailored by a local man who gave me a discount because he said he believed in young couples starting out. That suit saw me through baptisms, funerals, anniversaries, job interviews, and graduations. Every time I put it on, Margaret would pat my chest and say, "My handsome man." She never cared that it was the same one. She cared that I was there, standing beside her, shoulder to shoulder. But Margaret's been gone 15 years now. Cancer took her too soon, and since then, it's been just me and Emily. Raising her alone wasn't easy, but I never complained. I worked nights, saved pennies in a jar for her school trips, and skipped vacations so she could have braces, books, and a shot at college. That suit? It stayed pressed and ready, always waiting for the next important milestone in her life. Funny how a piece of fabric can carry history. When I look at it, I don't see wrinkles or outdated stitching. I see my wife's proud eyes the day Emily learned to walk. I see the tears I tried to hide when I dropped Emily off at kindergarten, and the way Margaret squeezed my hand, whispering, "She'll be fine. She has you." But Emily doesn't see that. Maybe I should have noticed the distance creeping in sooner. Maybe I should have realized that in her new world, one filled with friends who judged clothes more than character, my navy suit wasn't a symbol of sacrifice anymore. It was to her a punchline. I still remember the first hint of it months before her graduation. We were at a cafe, a place she liked because it had the kind of coffee drinks I couldn't even pronounce. She eyed my jacket, frayed at the cuffs, and asked, half joking, "Dad, don't you ever think about updating your wardrobe?" I chuckled, brushed it off. "Why fix what isn't broken?" I told her. She rolled her eyes and changed the subject. I laughed that day. But later that night, folding the jacket over the armchair, I thought of Margaret. I wondered what she would say if she'd seen Emily's expression. Half embarrassment, half shame. My heart felt heavier than the fabric in my hands. Still, I kept telling myself it was nothing. Kids grow up, they change. Maybe I was just being sensitive. But the truth is, that small remark was only the beginning. What I didn't know then was that my daughter, my pride and joy, the girl I once carried on my shoulders so she could see parades and fireworks, would one day cut me down with words sharper than any knife. And worse, she'd do it in front of a room full of strangers. That's where the story really begins. The thing about betrayal is, it doesn't come crashing down all at once. It seeps in, quietly, like water through a crack in the ceiling. You don't notice it until one day the plaster caves in. For me, it started small. A change in tone, a certain distance in my daughter's eyes. Emily had always been close to me growing up. After Margaret passed, she was just 16, and I remember she'd sit at the kitchen table doing homework while I made dinner. She'd ask me questions about math or history, and I'd do my best to answer. Though truth be told, I was better with a wrench than a textbook. Still, she'd smile at me like I was her anchor in the storm. For years, that bond carried us. But somewhere between her leaving for college and stepping into her own adult world, something shifted. I'd call, and the conversations grew shorter. I'd offer advice, and she'd sigh like she already knew better. I kept telling myself, "She's just growing up, Walt. Don't take it to heart." Then came the cafe moment, the one I mentioned before. That was the first sting. But the sharper ones followed. One Sunday afternoon, Emily invited me to meet her friends. She was renting a small apartment downtown, and they were hosting a potluck. I wore my best shirt, clean, ironed, and carried a casserole dish of my late wife's recipe, tuna noodle bake. Simple, but it had fed us on lean nights and tasted like comfort. The moment I walked in, though, I could feel it. The glances, the polite smiles that didn't reach their eyes. Emily greeted me, but her hug was quick, distracted. "Oh, Dad, you didn't have to bring that," she said, wrinkling her nose. Her friends laughed softly, covering it with coughs. I stood there holding the warm dish, the steam curling into the air, and I felt about 2 feet tall. Still, I set it on the table, smiled, and tried to blend in. But the truth was, I didn't belong. Not in their world of designer clothes, trendy conversations, and sleek apartments filled with furniture that cost more than my first car. Later that evening, as I helped stack plates, one of her friends said, thinking I couldn't hear, "Your dad's sweet. Kind of old-fashioned, though, huh?" And Emily replied, "Yeah, he means well." The words weren't cruel, but the way she said them, like she had to apologize for me, cut deep. On the drive home, I kept both hands on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead. Margaret's voice echoed in my head. "She'll be fine, Walt. She has you." But in that moment, I wondered if maybe she didn't want me at all. A few weeks later came another sign. Emily asked if I'd be willing to help out with some graduation expenses, photos, announcements, things like that. I was happy to. I'd been saving for her milestones all my life. But then she slipped in a comment. "Oh, and maybe don't wear that old suit, Dad. Just this once. Maybe rent something. You know, so the pictures look nice." I smiled, nodded, but inside my chest tightened. That suit, the one I'd worn to every important moment of her life, wasn't good enough anymore. Not for her. Not for the world she was stepping into. I didn't argue. I never do. I just went home, hung the suit in its garment bag, and sat on the edge of my bed staring at it. I thought of Margaret again. How she used to say that suit made me look like a man who could weather any storm. Now to my daughter, it just made me look cheap. That was the first time I allowed myself to wonder, had all my sacrifices been invisible to her? You see, I wasn't afraid of being poor. I'd been poor before. What scared me was being forgotten, rewritten in my daughter's mind as some outdated, embarrassing relic instead of the man who carried her through every storm. The night before her graduation, I polished my shoes, pressed the suit, and laid it out on the chair by the door. I knew what she'd asked me to do, rent something nicer. But I also knew this. I wasn't showing up in a stranger's clothes. That suit was me. Every thread in it was a piece of our story. And I thought, maybe when she saw me there, clapping for her, smiling through my tears, she'd remember. But I was wrong. The next day, in a crowded hall filled with flashing cameras and applause, my daughter looked straight at me and laughed. That was the moment I realized. Sometimes the people you love the most can wound you deepest, and not even notice the blood on their hands. And it was also the moment the rest of this story began to unfold. Graduation morning started like every important day in my life had started. Quietly. The sun crept through the thin curtains of my bedroom, striping the wall with pale gold. I sat on the edge of my bed, tying my shoes slowly, deliberately, the way a man does when he knows the steps ahead carry more than just his weight. The navy suit hung from the back of my closet door, pressed the night before. I'd run my hand over the lapels a dozen times, checking for stray threads, making sure the shine of the buttons caught the light just so. To anyone else, it was an old suit, dated, worn, out of style. But to me, it was history. It was Margaret's voice in my ear telling me I looked like a man who belonged anywhere. It was the suit I'd worn when I signed Emily's first tuition check, proud tears smudging the ink. I thought about her words from weeks before. Maybe rent something nicer, Dad? The sting was still there, but I told myself, she's nervous. It's her big day. Don't take it personal. I slipped into the jacket, buttoned it carefully, and stared into the mirror. A 72-year-old man stared back at me. Wrinkles etched deep into my forehead, gray hair thinning at the sides. But my tie was straight, my shoes polished. I looked presentable. More than that. I looked like a father who showed up. The auditorium was buzzing when I arrived. Families clustered together, snapping photos, straightening caps and gowns. I found my seat near the middle, clutching the program in my hands. My chest swelled with pride as I scanned for Emily's name. Emily Hayes, Bachelor of Science, summa cum laude. My girl, my only child. She had done it. When the graduates began to walk, the crowd erupted in applause. Cameras flashed like fireworks. I craned my neck, searching, until finally, there she was, Emily, cap tassel swinging, robe flowing, a smile wide enough to fill the room. My heart hammered against my ribs. I clapped until my palms stung. And then, it happened. She caught sight of me. Our eyes met across the sea of faces. For just a moment, I thought she'd wave, or beam at me the way she used to in her school plays. Instead, her gaze flicked down to my suit. Her smile faltered, then returned, but sharper, tighter. She leaned toward the girl walking beside her, whispered something, and then she laughed. Not just laughed, smirked, shook her head. And I swear I saw the words form on her lips, though I could barely hear them over the cheers. He looks cheap. The girl beside her stifled a giggle. Two more behind them glanced at me and chuckled. And in that instant, the world tilted. The applause around me blurred into white noise. My hands, still clapping, suddenly felt hollow, robotic. My throat tightened. I wanted to vanish, to fold myself small into the program in my hands. Every wrinkle on my suit, every faded seam, every hour of overtime it represented, it all twisted into a weapon, turned against me by the very person I had worn it for. I sat frozen, smiling faintly as though nothing had happened, pretending for the strangers who glanced my way, pretending for Emily, though she never looked at me again, pretending for Margaret, whose memory pressed heavy on my chest. Because what else could I do? Stand up and shout? Number. That's not who I am. I clapped, I cheered, I even wiped at my eyes when her name was called. Outwardly, I was the proud father every graduate deserves. Inwardly, I was crumbling. When the ceremony ended, families swarmed the graduates. Balloons, flowers, photographs. It was chaos wrapped in joy. I pushed through, searching for Emily. I found her with a group of friends, all posing for pictures, laughing. She spotted me, her smile thinning. "Dad," she said, her tone clipped, like she was caught between obligation and embarrassment. "There you are." "I'm proud of you, Em," I managed. My voice cracked, but I covered it with a cough. "Thanks," she said quickly, before turning back to her friends. One of them joked, "Come on, one more picture, Em," and she rushed to join them. I stood there, holding the small bouquet of carnations I'd brought, Margaret's favorite. Emily didn't even take them. So I waited and waited. Until finally she allowed me one photo. Just one. She leaned in, barely, her smile stiff. I wrapped an arm around her shoulders, the suit tight across my chest, and the camera flashed. That was it. That was my daughter's graduation moment. On the drive home, I replayed it all again and again. Her laugh, her words, the way she looked at me, like I was a stain on the fabric of her new life. The carnations wilted on the passenger seat, never handed over. My tie felt like it was strangling me. And when I walked into my house, quiet, dim, filled with memories, I draped the suit carefully over the chair by the door. For the first time in 40 years, I looked at it and wondered if maybe she was right. Maybe I did look cheap. But then, I thought of Margaret, her voice, her faith in me. "You're the man who weathers storms, Walt. Don't you forget that." And I realized Emily's words hadn't broken me. Not yet. They'd only planted the seed of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Resolve. Because love, even wounded love, can be stronger than shame. And if Emily thought my suit made me look cheap, she was about to learn what sacrifice really cost. That night, the house was too quiet. When Margaret was alive, we used to come home from events buzzing with chatter. She'd slip off her shoes, I'd loosen my tie, and we'd sit at the kitchen table replaying every little detail. She'd always brag about Emily, how she sang louder than the others at her choir concert, how her science project stood out among the rest, how she walked across the stage with confidence. Margaret had a way of seeing the light in everything, of weaving even the smallest moments into a tapestry of pride. But tonight, there was no one waiting at the kitchen table, no stew warming on the stove, just silence. I set the carnations on the counter. Their petals drooped, wilted from the heat of the day, their stems bent and tired. I'd carried them around all afternoon, hoping she'd take them, hoping they'd mean something. She didn't. The suit was still on my back, stiff and heavy, holding the scent of cologne and the faintest trace of dust from the old auditorium seats. I sat down in my recliner, and the weight of it pressed against me like a reminder I couldn't shake off. Cheap. That word rolled around in my head like a stone in a tin can, loud and relentless. I had worn that suit when I buried Margaret. It was the one she picked out with me, said it made me look like a man capable of anything. And yet my own daughter looked at it and at me and saw only something outdated, something to be mocked. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, and stared at the floor. The memories came uninvited. The Christmas morning when Emily was 5. She'd run into the living room, hair wild, face glowing, and squealed over the second-hand dollhouse I'd worked 2 extra shifts to buy. She didn't care. It wasn't new. She didn't care the paint was chipped. She hugged me so hard I nearly fell over. The night she was 12, and sick with the flu. I sat on the floor beside her bed, suit jacket draped over her like a blanket because the fever made her shiver. She whispered, "Don't leave me, Daddy." And I didn't, not for a second. The day she got accepted into college, I wore the suit to the financial aid office, papers in hand, trembling with nerves. I signed every form they put in front of me, promising away years of savings. She had hugged me then, tears wetting my shoulder. "I'll make you proud," she said. And now she couldn't stand the sight of me in that very suit. I thought about calling her that night, thought about asking her why. Why the joke? Why the laugh? Why the dismissal? But I didn't, because I knew the answer already. She wasn't trying to wound me, not deliberately. She was just ashamed of me, of where she came from, of the man who had given up everything to get her where she stood. And that realization cut deeper than any insult could. I poured myself a glass of water, sat at the table, and opened the drawer where I kept Margaret's letters. Over the years, she'd written me notes, small things, slipped into lunchboxes or coat pockets. One caught my eye that night. The ink had faded, the paper yellowed at the edges. It read, "Don't measure your worth in dollars, Walt. Measure it in what you've given. One day, she'll see it." I pressed the letter to my chest, eyes burning. One day, she'll see it. But when? When she was older? When it was too late? Or maybe never? For the first time in my life, I wondered if all those sacrifices, every meal skipped, every overtime shift, every quiet night alone, had been invisible. If, in her eyes, I wasn't the father who gave her everything, but the relic who had nothing to offer. Loneliness settled over me like a heavy coat. It wasn't just that Margaret was gone. It wasn't just that Emily had mocked me. It was that I felt erased, forgotten. I thought of the future. Would she keep pushing me further from her life? Would she someday introduce me to her friends as just my dad, with that tight smile, hoping I'd fade into the background? Would I be the grandfather her kids barely knew, the man in old photographs they didn't understand? I closed my eyes and let the question swirl. Then, in the stillness, something else rose up. Not anger, not bitterness, but something quieter, firmer, resolve. If Emily couldn't see what that suit represented, maybe she needed to see something bigger, something undeniable. Not words, not reminders of old sacrifices, but proof. Proof of what her father's love had built, stone by stone, dollar by dollar. I thought of the folder tucked in my desk drawer, the one with decades of savings, careful investments, insurance payouts I had never touched. The quiet empire of a man who never spent on himself, but always saved for her. My heart steadied. Margaret's voice echoed again. One day, she'll see it. Maybe that day had finally come. I folded the letter carefully, slid it back into its envelope, and set it in the drawer. Then I hung the suit back on its hanger, smoothing the lapels with steady hands. I whispered into the empty room, "You'll see, Emily. You'll see exactly what this suit has cost." For the first time all evening, I felt a strange sense of peace. Not joy, not relief, but clarity. The kind of clarity that comes after you've been humiliated, broken open, and left to decide whether you'll stay down or stand up taller than ever before. And I knew then I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. When you get to my age, memories don't come in neat little boxes. They come in flashes, like someone scattering old photographs across the floor. Some are faded, some sharper than the day they happened. And after Emily's graduation, those flashes hit me harder than ever. I thought about the beginning, about Margaret. We met at a church social when I was just 24. I wasn't much to look at. Grease-stained work shirt, calloused hands, hair sticking out under a worn cap. But Margaret, she had this way of seeing through all that. She smiled at me like I was already more than I believed I could be. That night, she danced with me, even though I stepped on her toes. Afterward, she said, "Walt, you may not have rhythm, but you've got heart." That's enough. She was the one who pushed me to buy that suit. Every man needs one thing he can walk into a room wearing and know he belongs, she told me. So I saved 3 months' worth of pay, skipping lunches, patching my boots twice over, and bought it. Navy blue, tailored, sharp. I wore it at our wedding. Margaret said I looked like a man who could carry her through storms. And I tried. God knows I tried. When Emily was born, storms came quick. Bills piled up. Margaret had to quit work for a while, and the factory demanded more of me. I remember one night, Emily was 2, crying with fever. Margaret was exhausted, slumped in the rocking chair. I had just come home from a 16-hour shift, hands trembling from fatigue. But I took Emily, pressed her tiny body against my chest, and walked the floors until her cries softened. My work shirt was damp with her tears and sweat, but when she finally slept, I felt like I'd just won the biggest fight of my life. Sacrifice didn't feel like sacrifice then. It felt like love. Every milestone came with a cost. When Emily was 7, she wanted a bike, a shiny pink one with streamers on the handlebars. We couldn't afford it, not with the mortgage and groceries. But Margaret whispered, "She'll remember it forever, Walt." So I sold my fishing gear, the one hobby I had left. The day Emily saw that bike, her scream of delight nearly knocked me over. She rode it up and down the street until the sun went down. When she turned 16, she wanted to learn to drive. Her friends had cars, some brand new. We couldn't give her that. But I found an old beat-up Ford, fixed it up on weekends, and handed her the keys. She hugged me so tight that day, crying into my shoulder. "You're the best dad," she whispered. I believed her. When she went off to college, I sat at the kitchen table with stacks of bills and savings bonds. Margaret had passed by then. Cancer had eaten her away little by little, leaving me holding her hand at the hospital until she squeezed one last time and let go. At her funeral, I wore the navy suit. Emily clung to me, sobbing into the fabric. That suit carried both of us through the darkest storm of our lives. I promised Margaret at her grave, "I'll see her through school, no matter what it takes." And I did. Every month, I sent the tuition checks. I worked extra hours, cut corners, lived on beans and bread. While her friends went on spring break trips, Emily called home to ask for grocery money. And I sent it, no hesitation. Because that's what fathers do. But I'll tell you something no one admits out loud. Sacrifice leaves scars. You don't notice them at first, but years later, they ache. My back still hurts from those double shifts. My savings never grew because every spare cent went to her. My house stayed modest. My clothes stayed plain. And you know what? I never minded. Because every time Emily called me Dad, every time she said she was proud, it healed those scars. Until the day she laughed. That day, her cap and gown, surrounded by friends, she didn't see the man who carried her through every storm. She saw only a suit too old, a father too simple, a presence she wished were less noticeable. And that's what stung. Not just the word cheap, but the erasure, the rewriting of history. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the old photographs pinned to the fridge. Emily with her dollhouse, Emily with her first bike, Emily in her prom dress smiling as I pinned the corsage, Emily at Margaret's funeral, clinging to me like I was her anchor. And I thought, did all of that vanish? with one laugh, one comment, one shift of her eyes. But then another memory surfaced. The last words Margaret spoke to me when the pain was too much, and the doctors were whispering in the hall. She gripped my hand, eyes burning through me, and said, "Don't just raise her to live. Raise her to see." I didn't understand then, but maybe I did now. Emily didn't see. She didn't see the sacrifices stitched into that suit, the decades of love holding it together. She didn't see me, not really, but she would. The thought settled in my chest like a stone, not heavy with despair, but solid with determination. If Margaret's words meant anything, if my life's work meant anything, Emily would see it. Not through scolding, not through guilt, but through something undeniable. I stood, walked to the old desk in the corner, and pulled open the drawer. Inside was the folder, thick, worn at the edges. Bank statements, insurance bonds, certificates of deposit, savings I had built quietly, brick by brick, over decades. Money I never touched, never flaunted. Money meant for her future. I ran my fingers over the papers. This wasn't just money. It was proof. Proof of every hour, every shift, every sacrifice. And I knew then, when the time was right, I would hand it to her. Not to buy her love, not to silence her laughter, but to open her eyes. Because sometimes love doesn't speak. It shows. And when it shows, it cannot be denied. Grief is heavy. But humiliation, that's something else. Humiliation lights a fire you didn't know you still had in you. For days after Emily's graduation, I carried her words around like stones in my pockets. I went through the motions, watering the garden, walking to the corner store for bread, nodding to the neighbors. But inside, I was burning. Every time I passed the suit hanging in my closet, it was like the fabric whispered back at me, "Cheap, cheap, cheap." And yet, underneath the ache, something steadier began to grow, a quiet resolve. One afternoon I was sitting on the porch, the radio playing softly in the background. Old country music, the kind Margaret used to hum while she folded laundry. A neighbor, Tom, walked over. He's a good man, retired carpenter, raised 3 kids of his own. He leaned against the railing and asked how the graduation went. I hesitated. My instinct was to plaster on a smile, to say it was wonderful. But instead, I just shook my head. "She laughed at me," I admitted, my voice catching. "Laughed at the suit. Said I looked cheap." Tom frowned, shook his head slow. "Kids these days don't understand, Walt. They don't know what it takes. They think money grows on trees." I didn't want her to be ashamed of me, I muttered. "Don't you go thinking that way," Tom said firmly. "You gave that girl everything. One day she'll see it." His words echoed Margaret's. One day she'll see it. But I knew something then that maybe Tom didn't. Waiting for one day wasn't enough. I was 72. My days weren't endless. If I wanted Emily to understand, truly understand, I had to show her now, while there was still time. That night I pulled out the folder again, spread the papers across the kitchen table. Years of careful saving stared back at me. Bank statements, bonds, certificates. To anyone else it was just paperwork. To me it was decades of sacrifice turned tangible. I remembered the choices, the vacations I never took, the new truck I never bought, the dinners skipped so tuition could be paid. Every line on those papers was a record of love in numbers and ink. And suddenly I saw it clearly. This was my answer. Not to scold her, not to shout about sacrifice. Words fade, after all. Laughter drowns them out. But actions can silence a room. I thought back to Margaret's last days. She had wasted away in that hospital bed, body frail, eyes still fierce. She had looked at me and said, "Don't just raise her to live. Raise her to see." I hadn't understood then, But now I did. Emily had lived. She'd gone to school, made friends, built a life. But she hadn't seen. She hadn't seen the hands that built that life, the scars that bought her comfort, the suit that held our story. And if she wouldn't see it on her own, I would make sure she couldn't ignore it. I called an old friend the next day, George, a retired lawyer who once helped me settle Margaret's estate. We met at a diner over black coffee and eggs. I slid the folder across the table. I want to transfer it, I told him. Quietly. A house. In her name, George raised an eyebrow. That's generous. It's not generosity, I said. It's a lesson. He studied me for a long moment, then nodded. All right, we'll make it happen. Over the next few weeks, I worked quietly. No fanfare, no announcements. While Emily was busy celebrating with friends, I was signing papers, meeting with realtors, walking through modest homes on quiet streets. I found one not far from my own, a little two-bedroom with a sturdy porch and a garden in the back. Nothing flashy, but solid, a foundation that would hold. As I walked through the empty rooms, I imagined Emily here, setting down groceries on the counter, curling up on the couch, hanging her own family's photographs on the walls someday. And I thought, this is how she'll learn. Not from lectures, not from guilt, from standing inside what her father built for her, even when she mocked the very man who built it. When the deed was finalized, I tucked it into a plain envelope, heavy in my hand, final. And I knew when I'd give it to her, not in private, not with just the two of us, but in front of others, so she would have no choice but to face not only me, but herself. I wasn't planning revenge in the cruel sense. I wasn't out to humiliate her the way she had humiliated me. What I wanted was something deeper. I wanted her to feel the weight of what she had dismissed, to understand what sacrifice looks like when it's put on paper, signed, sealed, undeniable. That was the moment I stopped being the man with slumped shoulders in a suit too old. That was the moment I became the man who would make his daughter see. And for the first time since her graduation, I felt my spine straighten, my chest lift. The fire in me wasn't shame anymore. It was purpose. The world had told me I was outdated. My daughter had told me I was cheap. But when the day came, when I placed that envelope in her hands, the truth would roar louder than any laugh. And she wouldn't just hear it, she would see it. When people think of revenge, they imagine shouting matches, slammed doors, maybe even fists flying. But that's not the kind of man I am. I don't believe in fire for fire. I believe in something quieter, something stronger, poetic justice. And if life had taught me anything, it was this: silence has power. You don't need to scream when the truth itself can echo louder than any words. After I decided to buy the house, everything else fell into place. It was almost like Margaret's hand was guiding me. I found myself humming her old tune as I gathered papers, made phone calls, signed documents. For weeks, my life had a new rhythm, one built not around work, but around a plan. The house itself was nothing grand. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that smelled faintly of fresh paint. But it had character. A small front porch, a sturdy oak tree shading the yard, and a backyard just big enough for a garden. The kind of place a young woman could start her life on solid ground. I chose it on purpose, not for its beauty, not for its price, but because it mirrored my own home. Humble, dependable, built not to impress, but to endure. George, my lawyer friend, raised his eyebrows when I signed the deed. "You're sure about this, Walt?" "I'm sure," I said, my hand steady on the pen. He leaned back. "Most men your age would be thinking about their retirement, not giving away houses." "I'm not most men," I answered simply. He studied me, then chuckled. "Fair enough. Just make sure she knows what this means." "Oh," I said, sliding the signed deed into its envelope. She will. I walked out of that office with the envelope tucked under my arm, the spring air crisp against my face. For the first time in months, my shoulders didn't feel so heavy. But I knew this wasn't just about handing over a house. If I simply gave it to her, she might take it as another gift, another sacrifice, something to accept casually. Number. This had to mean more. She had to see it for what it truly was, the embodiment of every sacrifice she'd laughed at, every scar she'd overlooked, every thread of that suit she'd mocked. So I waited. I didn't call her right away. I didn't tell her what I was planning. I let the envelope sit in my desk drawer, resting on top of Margaret's old letters. Some nights I'd take it out, hold it in my hand, and whisper, "She'll see, Maggie. She'll finally see." In the meantime, Emily kept her distance. She called once or twice, short conversations, polite but hurried. "Busy, Dad. Things are crazy right now." I could hear the clinking of glasses, the laughter of friends in the background. She wasn't calling to connect. She was calling out of obligation. That hurt. But I didn't push. Let her think I was fading into the background. Let her think I was just the old man in the cheap suit. Because soon enough I would step back into the light. The opportunity came quicker than I expected. A week after graduation, Emily decided to host a dinner at her apartment. A little celebration, she said, just friends and a few family members. She invited me almost as an afterthought, her voice hesitant. "You don't have to come if you don't want to, Dad," she said. "Oh, I'll come," I told her, my voice calm. "Wouldn't miss it." She seemed surprised, but didn't protest. That night, as I laid out my clothes, my hand hovered over the closet. There was no debate. I reached for the navy suit, pressed, polished, ready, the very same one she hated. Because this wasn't just about showing up. It was about standing tall in the skin and the fabric that had carried me this far. The envelope slipped perfectly into the inner pocket of the jacket. I patted it once, a silent reminder of what was coming. When I arrived at her apartment, laughter spilled out into the hallway before I even knocked. I could hear clinking glasses, the hum of conversation, the upbeat rhythm of music. I stepped inside and was immediately hit with stares, some curious, some pitying. Emily's friends filled the room, dressed sharp, glasses of wine in hand. "Dad," Emily said, her tone too bright, too rehearsed. She hugged me quickly, then stepped back, smoothing her dress. I saw her eyes flicker down to the suit. Just for a moment. A flash of annoyance. Or was it embarrassment? I smiled, said nothing. The evening went as I expected. Emily played hostess, laughing with her friends, clinking glasses. I sat in the corner, listening, invisible. Just the old man in the old suit. Until the moment came. Toward the end of the night, when the plates were cleared and the chatter softened, Emily raised her glass. "Thank you all for being here," she said. "It means so much to celebrate with the people who matter most." I watched her, waited. My hand slipped into my pocket, feeling the weight of the envelope, and when the room fell quiet, I stood. "I'd like to say something," I said, my voice steady. Dozens of eyes turned to me. Emily froze, her smile faltering. I didn't raise my voice, didn't scold. I simply reached into my jacket, pulled out the envelope, and held it out to her. "For you," I said softly. The room hushed. Emily blinked, confused. "What is it?" she asked. "Open it," I told her. And as she tore the flap, unfolding the crisp papers inside, the silence deepened. Her eyes scanned the words. Confusion, realization, shock. And then, the first tear. The deed trembled in her hands. The friends who had laughed at me weeks earlier leaned forward, whispering. Emily's voice broke as she whispered, "Dad, this is a house." I nodded. Yours. The suit had been mocked. The man had been dismissed. But in that moment, standing in that room, the truth was undeniable. I wasn't cheap. I wasn't a relic. I was the man who gave her the ground she stood on. For a long moment, the room was frozen. Emily stood there, the deed trembling in her hands, her eyes wide and shining with tears. Her friends leaned in closer, whispering among themselves. Some mouths hung open. No one reached for their glasses. No one laughed. The silence was heavy, a silence you could almost touch. Emily looked at me as if she didn't recognize me. "Dad, I don't understand. Why would you—" Her voice cracked. I didn't rush to answer. I let her sit in that silence, let her feel the weight of it pressing in on her. Then slowly I spoke. "Because, Emily, this is what that suit paid for." A murmur rippled through the room. She blinked, tears spilling now. "What do you mean?" I straightened my shoulders. My voice didn't shake, not once. "You mocked me for wearing the same suit. You laughed, said I looked cheap. But do you know why I've worn this same suit for 40 years? Because every dollar I didn't spend on myself, I spent on you. Every overtime shift, every skipped vacation, every bill I pinched pennies to pay. Those choices built this." I gestured to the paper in her hands. "That house, that deed, that foundation beneath your feet. It's not just money. It's your mother's prayers. It's my sweat. It's the life we built for you." The room was still. So still you could hear the faint tick of her kitchen clock. Emily's lip trembled. I took a step closer, my eyes fixed on hers. "Cheap? Number, this suit has seen more sacrifice than you can imagine. I wore it the day I married your mother. I wore it when I signed your tuition checks. I wore it when I buried her, and you clung to me like I was the only thing holding you together. This suit," I pressed my hand against my chest, "is everything we are. And if you can't see that, then maybe you never truly saw me at all." A few of her friends shifted uncomfortably. One young man lowered his eyes, ashamed. Another girl wiped at her face quietly, moved by words not even meant for her. Emily's tears fell freely now. She clutched the deed as if it were a lifeline, her shoulders shaking. "Dad, I didn't mean it. I didn't know." I held up my hand, stopping her. My voice softened, but it didn't lose its edge. "That's the thing, Emily. You didn't know. You didn't care to know. You looked at me at what I wore, and you laughed. You thought it was about appearances. But life isn't about appearances. It's about what you stand for. And I've stood for you all your life." Her sob caught in her throat. "I was wrong," she whispered. "I was so wrong." I let the silence hang again, let her words settle in the air. Then I nodded once. "Yes, you were." The whole room seemed to exhale at once. Chairs creaked as people shifted. Glasses clinked as someone set theirs down. But no one said anything. No one dared, because the truth was laid bare between us, undeniable. Emily stepped forward then, slowly, like a child again. She pressed the deed against her chest and whispered through tears, "I don't deserve this." I looked at her, my daughter, my pride, my heartbreak. "You don't earn love, Emily. You honor it. And I've loved you enough to give you everything, even when you mocked me for how I gave it." She collapsed into my arms, sobbing into the lapel of the suit she had ridiculed. And I held her, steady, unshaken. For the first time in years, she felt small in my embrace, like the little girl who once whispered, "Don't leave me, Daddy." Around us, her friends sat in stunned silence. They had laughed with her once. Now, not one of them could meet my eyes. The shame in the room wasn't mine anymore. It belonged to her, to them, And in that moment, I felt no bitterness, just clarity. I spoke softly, almost to myself, but loud enough for the room to hear. A man isn't measured by the clothes he wears, but by the sacrifices he makes. And this suit, it's the most expensive thing I own. The words lingered in the air, unchallenged. Emily sobbed harder. She kept whispering apologies, promises, pleas. And though I didn't answer them all, I held her tighter. Because sometimes justice doesn't come from shouting someone down. It comes from standing so firm in your truth that the weight of it brings them to their knees. And that's exactly what happened that night. I've always believed that the truth doesn't need a spotlight. It shines on its own, brighter than any stage light or camera flash. That night in Emily's apartment, the truth had filled the room until no one could ignore it. My daughter, who had once mocked me for looking cheap, now clutched the deed to her own home, sobbing in front of a dozen witnesses. Her friends, young, sharp, stylish, sat frozen. Some stared at their laps, ashamed. Others stole glances at me, their eyes wide, as if suddenly seeing me for the first time. Not as an old man in a tired suit, but as the father who had carried his daughter farther than any of them knew. It was almost comical, in a painful way. These same kids had laughed along with her weeks earlier, whispering about how outdated I looked. Now, not one of them could muster a smile. Their wine glasses sat untouched. Their conversations had dried up. The only sound was Emily's broken sobs against my chest. I let her cry for a while. My hand rested gently on her back, steady but not indulgent. This wasn't about punishment, not really. It was about truth. And sometimes the truth has to break you down before it builds you back up. When she finally pulled away, her mascara streaked down her cheeks, she tried to speak. "Dad, I raised my hand gently, cutting her off. "Not now, Emily, not here." I turned, my gaze sweeping over the room. Dozens of young eyes avoided mine. Some fidgeted with napkins, some stared at the floor. The silence was suffocating, but I let it hang. "You've all heard enough tonight," I said calmly, my voice carrying to every corner of that apartment. "You saw a man mocked for what he wore, and now you see what that man's sacrifice built. Let that be the last laugh at his expense." Not a soul dared to reply. A young man shifted uncomfortably, muttering, "Sir, we didn't know." His voice trailed off when I looked at him. "You didn't need to know," I said, "but you do now." I could feel Margaret with me then, her presence like a hand on my shoulder. She had always believed that dignity was louder than anger, and as I stood there, surrounded by silence, I understood why. Emily's shoulders shook as she gripped the deed tighter, tears dripping onto the papers. She looked so small in that moment, so unlike the confident young woman who had rolled her eyes at me just weeks before. And though part of me ached for her, another part whispered, she needed this. I slipped my hands into my pockets, standing tall. "I'll leave you to your evening," I said, my voice calm. "Enjoy your friends. And remember, what looks cheap at first glance might just be priceless once you learn its story." Then I turned and walked toward the door. The air shifted behind me. Whispers rose, hushed but urgent. I didn't need to hear the words. I knew what they were saying. They were replaying the scene in their minds, realizing they had witnessed something heavy, something raw, something they wouldn't forget. As I stepped into the hallway, Emily called out, "Dad!" Her voice cracked, desperate. I paused, turned slightly. She stood in the doorway, eyes swollen, clutching the deed against her chest like it was her only anchor. "Please, don't go yet. I need—" But I shook my head gently. "You have what you need. Think about what it means." Her lips trembled, but no words came. She lowered her gaze, and I walked away. The elevator doors closed in front of me, the hum of the motor filling the silence. For the first time in a long while, I felt no weight pressing me down. My suit clung to me like an old friend, proud, dignified, unbroken. By the time I stepped out onto the street, the night air was cool against my face. I breathed it in deep, like a man finally freed from a long, suffocating room. Behind me in that apartment, my daughter had been exposed, not by anger, not by spite, but by truth made visible to everyone she wanted to impress. And that's the thing about truth. It doesn't just humble you in private. It humbles you in public, where you can't escape it. Word travels fast in small circles. Within days, I heard whispers from neighbors, from people who knew Emily's friends. They spoke about the moment at the party, about the father in the old suit who gave his daughter a house. And for once, the story being told wasn't about me being outdated or embarrassing. It was about the man who had given everything without ever asking for anything in return. Emily called the next morning. 6 times. I didn't answer. Not yet. I needed her to sit with it, to let the shame settle into something deeper. Understanding. Because understanding doesn't come from a quick apology. It comes from silence, reflection, and the weight of knowing you were wrong. That evening, she came to my house. I watched her from the window as she stood on the porch, clutching the deed in her hands. She looked smaller than I'd ever seen her, almost like the little girl who once begged me not to leave her side when she was sick. But I didn't rush to open the door. Not this time. I let her knock. Once, twice, 3 times. Because sometimes love needs distance. Sometimes the only way to make someone truly see is to step back and let them walk toward the truth themselves. And when I finally did open that door, her first words weren't rehearsed or defensive. They were broken, raw. "Dad," she whispered, her voice shaking, "I'm so sorry." And though I didn't say it out loud, I thought to myself, Now she begins to see. The thing about apologies is that words alone don't carry much weight. Anyone can say, "I'm sorry." What matters is whether the person behind the words has changed. When I opened the door that evening, Emily stood there clutching the deed like it might slip through her fingers. Her hair was pulled back hastily, her face bare of makeup, her eyes red and swollen. For once, she didn't look like the polished young woman desperate to impress her friends. She just looked like my little girl again. Scared, trembling, desperate for forgiveness. "Dad," she whispered, her voice breaking, "I'm so sorry. For what I said. For how I treated you. I don't know what came over me. I studied her for a long moment. My instinct, the father in me, wanted to pull her into my arms immediately, to wipe her tears away and say it was all fine. But another part of me, the man who had carried humiliation home in silence, knew better. If I forgave too quickly, too easily, she would never understand the full weight of what she had done. So I stepped aside and let her in without a word. The house smelled faintly of coffee and old wood. She looked around, her gaze landing on the photos covering the walls. Pictures of her childhood, Christmas mornings, birthdays, her prom night, her first car. She walked slowly, her fingers brushing one frame. "You kept all of these," she said softly. "Of course I did," I answered. "They're reminders." Her eyes flicked to me nervously. "Reminders of?" I held her gaze steady. "Of why I sacrificed everything, and of why it hurt so much when my own daughter laughed at me." Her lip trembled, and fresh tears welled. She gripped the deed tighter, almost crumpling it. "I didn't mean it, Dad, I swear. I was just embarrassed," I finished for her. "Embarrassed of me." She lowered her head, ashamed. "Yes," she whispered. "I was wrong. I see that now. Everyone saw it that night, and I can't take it back. I walked past her to the kitchen table, the same table where Margaret and I once stayed up late balancing bills and planning Emily's future. I sat down and gestured for her to sit too. "Emily," I said quietly, "I don't care what your friends think of me. Never have. But when you mocked me, you weren't mocking a suit. You were mocking the years I gave up so you could stand where you are now. You were mocking your mother's memory. Every shift I worked, every meal I skipped, every scar I earned. That's what hurt." Her shoulders shook as she cried. "I didn't see it. I was blind." I let her cry. I didn't rush in to soothe her. Sometimes tears are part of the lesson. After a long pause, I spoke again. "Do you know why I gave you that house?" She shook her head, wiping her cheeks. "Because I want you to have what your mother and I never did, a foundation, something solid, somewhere you can build your life. But more than that, I wanted you to see what real sacrifice looks like, to understand that dignity isn't in shiny new things, but in the people who stand by you when the storms come." She covered her face with her hands. "I don't deserve it, Dad. Not after what I said." "No," I said firmly, "you don't. But that's the point. Love isn't about deserving. It's about giving. And I've given you everything because you're my daughter. That doesn't mean the wound disappears overnight. It doesn't mean trust snaps back like a rubber band. It means you've been given a chance to do better, to honor what was given instead of mocking it." She lowered her hands slowly, eyes swollen but steady. "I'll make it right. I promise." I sighed, leaning back in my chair. My eyes fell on the photograph above the mantel. Margaret holding a toddler Emily in her arms, both laughing, both radiant. "You don't need to promise me," I said softly. "Promise her." Emily turned to look at the photo. Her tears came again, but quieter this time, steadier. She nodded slowly, whispering, "I will, Mom. I will." For the first time that evening, I felt a small measure of peace. Not triumph, not revenge. Peace. Because Margaret's words had come true. Emily was beginning to see. The rest of the evening passed quietly. She stayed for dinner. Just soup and bread, nothing fancy. We talked, not about the party or the embarrassment, but about simple things. Her classes, her plans for work, the garden out back. She laughed once or twice, but the laughter was softer, humbled. When she finally left, she hugged me tight, tighter than she had in years. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered. I didn't answer right away. I just held her, and when I finally let go, I said, "Don't thank me yet. Thank me by remembering, by never forgetting what it cost." She nodded, pressing the deed against her chest as she walked out into the night. When the door closed behind her, I sat in the quiet again. But it wasn't the same quiet as the night of her graduation. This silence was lighter, calmer. I looked over at the suit hanging by the door, still pressed, still dignified. And I thought, maybe it's not just a suit anymore. Maybe it's a monument, not to wealth, not to appearances, but to sacrifice, to love, to a lifetime of giving more than I ever took. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel humiliated. I felt proud. Because in the end, I hadn't just given my daughter a house. I had given her something far greater. A lesson, a truth, a memory she would carry longer than any possession. And that was enough. Time has a way of revealing what words can't. The days after that night at Emily's apartment felt different. For years, I'd walked around with my shoulders slightly hunched, as if carrying an invisible burden I couldn't quite put down. After the confrontation, after the envelope, after the silence that spoke louder than any scolding, I felt lighter. Not young, not free of pain, but lighter. Emily didn't vanish back into her circle of friends the way I feared she might. Instead, she began showing up. Slowly at first, almost hesitantly, as if testing whether I would push her away. She came by one Saturday morning with a basket of groceries. "I thought you might need some things," she said nervously. I chuckled and told her I'd been feeding myself for 72 years just fine. Still, I let her unpack the bag. Another week, she appeared in the garden while I was pulling weeds. She crouched down, dirt on her knees, and said, "Teach me how to do this." That was the first time in a long while I saw her hands stained with soil, not manicured polish. Margaret would have smiled at that. Her calls grew longer, her visits more frequent, and little by little I noticed something changing in her eyes. A softness, a gratitude she hadn't known how to show before. But it wasn't just her. The story of that night spread, first through her circle of friends, then wider. People in town began to whisper, "That's the man who gave his daughter a house," or "That's the father who never spent on himself so his daughter could succeed." For years I'd been invisible. Now, without meaning to, I had become something else entirely, an example. One evening, as Emily and I sat on the porch, she turned to me and said, "They keep talking about it, Dad. About you giving me the house. My friends, they can't stop telling the story." "And what do you say?" I asked. She hesitated, then smiled faintly. "I tell them I didn't deserve it. But I also tell them I'll spend the rest of my life trying to." I looked at her then, the same daughter who once rolled her eyes at my old suit, now speaking with humility I never thought I'd hear, and I felt something in me finally settle. It wasn't revenge I'd wanted, not really. Revenge burns hot but fades quickly. What I wanted was clarity, justice, the kind that doesn't scream but speaks in echoes, reshaping the way someone sees the world. And Margaret had been right all along. Emily was beginning to see. Months passed. Emily moved into the house I'd bought her. She painted the walls herself, planted flowers in the yard, even hosted me for Sunday dinners. The first time she cooked for me there, she set the table nervously, as if hoping I wouldn't notice the burned edges of the roast. I didn't say a word, just smiled and ate every bite. Because in that moment, it wasn't about the food. It was about the effort, about her trying to give back in the only way she knew how. One evening, as we sat in her living room, she glanced at the Old Navy suit hanging neatly in the garment bag I'd brought over to show her. Her eyes filled with tears. "I'll never laugh at it again," she whispered. "I'll never forget what it means." I placed my hand gently on hers. "See that you don't. Because one day, you'll have a child of your own, and you'll sacrifice in ways they may never understand. You'll give them more than they realize, and if they ever mock you for it, you'll know exactly how it feels." Her tears fell, but she nodded. "I'll remember, Dad. I promise," and I believed her. Now, when I walk past the closet and see that suit, I no longer hear her cruel laugh echoing in my ears. I hear Margaret's voice instead. "My handsome man." I see the sacrifices stitched into every seam, the love folded into every crease. And I know it has carried me and my daughter farther than any fine clothes ever could. In the end, my revenge wasn't loud. It wasn't cruel. It was quiet, deliberate, and rooted in love. I didn't humiliate Emily with anger. I let the truth humiliate her into humility. And from that, something better grew. Sometimes justice doesn't come with gavel strikes or shouting matches. Sometimes it comes in an envelope, handed over at the exact right moment when silence and truth collide. I don't know how many years I have left. My knees ache, My hands tremble more than they used to, and the nights feel longer. But I know this. I've lived a life of sacrifice, and it wasn't wasted. Because my daughter finally sees me, not as cheap, not as outdated, but as her father, the man who weathered every storm for her. And if that's the legacy I leave behind, then I can rest easy. Margaret once told me that love, real love, isn't flashy. It's steady, quiet, enduring. And tonight, as I hang my suit back in the closet, smoothing the fabric one last time, I realize she was right. This isn't just a suit. It's my story, our story. A story that, at last, my daughter understands. And that is enough.